Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are unpacking a challenging and a really dense set of texts. The Condition of Democracy, Volume 3, Postcolonial Democracy, along with some key excerpts from Volume 2. And this isn't your standard civics lesson. The systemic question this material addresses is, well, it's uncomfortable, but it's absolutely vital. How does liberal democracy operate not just as a system of freedom, but as a post-colonial power system?
Precisely. And we're really looking at why this question matters, beyond the pages of these books. We often think of democracy as the good guy of political systems. It's the default.
It's the goal, right? It's what everyone's supposed to be striving for.
Exactly. But the editors and authors here, they argue that liberal democracy often reproduces colonial hierarchies and exclusion, all while presenting itself as, universal and egalitarian.
So we're going to focus on patterns and structures today, not prescriptions. We're really trying to look at the machinery under the hood. And I have to be honest with you, right out of the gate, this material, it triggered a bit of a defensive reaction in me.
Oh, is that so? How come?
It did, because when we talk about democracy with a capital D, we're talking about the water we swim in. It's just the air we breathe. We're taught from childhood that it's the antidote to tyranny, the antidote to colonialism.
Of course.
And now we have these editors, Jürgen Mackert, Hannah Wolf, and Bryan S. arguing that democracy isn't the cure, but actually a carrier of the disease. I mean, that feels deeply counterintuitive.
It feels counterintuitive because it violates what sociologists would call the hegemonic discourse. We're all raised on a very specific, very curated story about Western civilization and its gifts to the world.
The benevolent West narrative.
That's the one. But to really understand this book, you have to sort of suspend that story for an hour. You have to look at democracy not as a set of ideals, liberty, fraternity, equality, but as a mechanical system, a system for distributing power.
A system that produces outputs. Specific, measurable outcomes.
Exactly. And if you judge a machine by what it actually produces, rather than what the user manual says it should produce, the picture starts to change quite dramatically. The editors here, they're sociologists, not political theorists.
That feels like an important distinction.
It's crucial. They weren't interested in what John Locke hoped would happen in a perfect world. They're looking at what is actually happening right now on the borders of Europe, in the mines of South Africa, and in the occupied territories of Palestine.
So let's set the stage a bit more. Who are these people and why are they writing this now? This is Volume 3 of a series called The Condition of Democracy. That title alone implies that the patient is sick.
The patient is in critical condition, I think, is the argument. The context here is what the editors call a global crisis of legitimacy. And they argue we are seeing a dual crisis.
Two things happening at once.
Right. And usually in our media, we treat them as completely separate news stories. Crisis A is happening in what they call the Western core. So North America, Western Europe. This is the hollowing out of democracy that we hear so much about.
This is the stuff we see on the news every night. Polarization, the rise of populism, figures like Trump or movements like Brexit, general social breakdown.
Yes, but the book goes much deeper than just people are angry. They analyze why. They point directly to the neoliberal turn of the last 40 years. The argument is that the state has slowly, methodically stripped itself of the power to actually help its citizens in meaningful economic ways.
How so?
Well, wealth has been redistributed upward to a massive, almost unbelievable degree. Public services have been privatized. And the average voter feels this profound loss of what they call economic sovereignty.
Meaning, I can vote for the left or I can vote for the right, but at the end of the day, the factory is still moving to China, and my rent is still going up.
That's it exactly. The levers that used to control the economy have been disconnected from the voting booth. So you feel powerless. That's crisis A. But then you have crisis B, which is the persistence or even intensification of colonial attitudes and violence in the global South, or on the very borders of the West.
And usually pundits say these things are unconnected. They say, well, we have domestic problems and then there are foreign policy problems, separate spheres.
The central thesis of this book, the absolute core of the argument, is that you cannot separate them. They're two sides of the very same coin. The editors argue quite bluntly that liberal democracy has a dark side.
I'm listening.
It isn't simply a domestic form of rule that treats everyone nicely inside its own borders. It is a geopolitical actor. And as an actor on the world stage, it has historically driven global oppression, colonization, and even genocide. The argument is that the system produces inequality and exclusion by design, not by accident.
Okay, I have to stop you there. By design. That is the phrase that sticks in my throat. It sounds conspiratorial. Are they suggesting there's some cabal of founding fathers or modern leaders sitting in a smoky room twirling their mustaches and planning to oppress the global south? Because usually we just chalk this stuff up to incompetence or resource scarcity. Why design?
It's a great question, and it's a really important clarification. It's not a conspiracy of individuals, it's a design of logic. Think of it like a computer program. If you write a piece of code that says, rule number 1, maximize profit, the program might eventually decide to fire all the workers, cut safety corners, and pollute the environment.
Right, the code isn't evil in a villainous sense.
No, it was just following the logic of its design. The editors argued that liberal democracy was built on a specific operating system, a core piece of code. The West versus the barbarians.
This goes back to what you mentioned earlier, the myth of Western civilization.
Yes. Jürgen Mackert's introduction brings up Adam Curtis's documentary, Hypernormalization. The idea is that we in the West live in a simplified, curated version of reality, a kind of fake world that's been constructed by politicians and corporations to keep things stable and predictable.
And part of that fake world is the myth that the West is the benevolent gardener of the world, patiently tending to the garden and keeping the chaotic jungle at bay.
Exactly. But the book argues that if you actually look at the founding fathers of liberalism, figures like John Locke, John Stuart Mill, the guys on our philosophy syllabi, that benevolence just falls apart.
It crumbles completely, doesn't it? The source material highlights what they call the classical liberal paradox. We're taught that John Stuart Mill, for instance, championed liberty. And he did. But for whom?
That's the question. For whom?
For white, property-owning men in England, basically.
Precisely. The book points out a really shocking assertion. These foundational figures were often fiercely anti-democratic at home because they feared the mob, the working class. Right. They didn't think the poor were capable of rational thought or self-governance. But abroad, in the colonies, it was so much worse.
How so?
They viewed colonized people not as citizens in waiting, not as people who just needed a bit of education, but as savages, beasts, or barbarians, people outside the circle of humanity.
So when they wrote all men are created equal, there was a massive silent asterisk next to the word men.
The asterisk was the size of the rest of the world. The system was built on the distinction that we, the civilized, have rights, and they, the barbarians, are targets for intervention, for civilizing, or for exploitation.
And the editors argued this is an ancient history.
Not at all. This civilized versus barbarian code is still running in the background of modern democracies. It's the hidden software. It's why we can have universal human rights conventions being signed in Paris or London, but tolerate absolute, breathtaking inhumanity at the borders of those same nations.
Which brings us to our first major deep dive into the machinery of the system, the concept of the container.
The nation-state as a container, yes.
Right. We tend to think of the nation-state as just the default setting of reality, like gravity or the sky. But the book treats it as a very specific, very artificial invention.
It is an artificial invention, and a relatively recent one in human history. In Volume 2, the authors discuss the concept of exclusionary closure. To understand this, imagine a very exclusive VIP club.
Okay, I'm picturing velvet ropes, big bouncers, a long line outside. The works.
Now, what gives a VIP membership its value? Why do people want to be in that club?
Well, it's valuable because I'm inside sipping champagne and most other people are outside in the cold. If you let everyone in, it's not a club anymore. It's just a room. The value is gone.
Exactly. The value is derived from the exclusion. The authors argue that modern democracy works on the very same principle. It is a container. Inside the container, you have all the goods, civil rights, the welfare state, the right to vote, physical safety, the rule of law.
All the benefits of citizenship.
All the benefits. But for those goods to have value and to be sustainable for the people inside, the container must rigidly and sometimes violently exclude the people outside.
So democracy isn't really about universal inclusion then. It's about managed privilege for a specific defined group.
That is the closure part of exclusionary closure.
Yeah.
The state closes the circle. And this leads to a very interesting mechanism the book calls usurpation.
Usurpation, that's a very medieval word. It sounds like something from Game of Thrones, someone stealing the crown.
That's effectively how the state sees it.
Yeah.
Usurpation is the sociological term for when the excluded group tries to claim the resources or privileges of the included group. When a refugee crosses a border without permission, they are, in the logic of the system, usurping the privilege of residency.
So from the perspective of the club members, the citizens, this person isn't just a traveler in need, they're a thief. They're trying to steal a slice of the pie.
Correct. And this helps explain the violence. The state views this act of usurpation as existential threat to its sovereignty, to the integrity of the container. The book uses the fascinating example of church asylum in Germany.
Church asylum? What's that?
It's a practice where churches, in defiance of the state, take in refugees who are about to be deported. They offer them sanctuary. Historically, the church is a non-state actor.
Right. It operates on a different set of rules.
And when a church says, this person is a human being and we will protect them, regardless of what your law says, the state views this as a direct challenge to its power. The church is engaging in usurpation of the state's exclusive right to decide who stays and who goes.
It's a clash of moralities, then. The church is operating on a logic of universal human rights, and the state is operating on the logic of exclusionary closure.
And the state usually wins that clash. This brings us directly to the so-called refugee crisis. The authors really flip the script on this term.
How so? Because crisis is the word we've heard every single day since 2015. A crisis of migration.
They argue it isn't a crisis of migration. People have moved for 10,000 years. It's not a new phenomenon. It is a crisis of the democratic system's inability to handle non-citizens without resorting to violence.
So the crisis is internal to the system, not external.
Precisely. The authors look at the Mediterranean Sea. We all know that thousands upon thousands of people have drowned there. It is one of the deadliest borders in the entire world.
And the standard narrative we get is that this is a tragedy. Oh, if only the smugglers weren't so evil, or if only the boats were better built. We view each drowning as a terrible accident.
But the system's view asks, is it an accident? Or is it a feature? Is it an output? The book argues that the Mediterranean has become a deadly border functionally. The death toll serves a purpose.
A purpose? That's a horrifying thought. What purpose could it serve?
It acts as the ultimate deterrent. It is the physical, brutal manifestation of exclusionary closure. If the border were safe and open, the container would leak, the VIP club would be flooded, and the value of the citizenship inside would, in the cold logic of the system, dilute.
That is chilling. You're saying the drowning isn't a bug, it's part of the architecture.
It's a passive defense mechanism. It's border control by other means.
Right.
And this links directly to the second major insight, which helps explain why the people inside the container, the voters, seem to support this. Why do we see regular people cheering for walls, for deportations, for tougher borders?
My first assumption is always just racism. Or, fear of terrorism, economic anxiety.
Those are the symptoms, for sure. But the root cause, according to the contributor Ozgi Yaka, who builds on the work of Wendy Brown, is much more pathetic in the philosophical sense of pathos. It's about psychological compensation.
Explain that term, psychological compensation.
Okay, so remember the dual crisis we started with, the hollowing out of democracy at home.
Right. I'm the citizen who has lost my economic power. Neoliberalism gutted my town. My job went overseas.
You feel powerless, completely powerless. You cannot control your wages. You cannot control the global market. You cannot stop the bank from foreclosing on your neighbor's home. You have lost your sense of agency. So psychologically, you are desperate for some sense of control over your life. You need to feel like a sovereign again, even in a small way.
So where do I go to get that feeling of power back?
You go to the border. The source calls this ersatz control. Ersatz meaning fake or substitute control. Because the citizen can no longer act as a ruler of their own economic destiny. They act as a bouncer at the door of the nation.
Wow. So the slogan, build the wall, isn't actually about infrastructure. It's a form of therapy.
It's Freudian neurotic behavior. The source literally compares it to a neurosis. The fixation on the border is a displacement activity. The logic is, I can't control the price of bread, but by God, I can control whether that person gets to stand on this piece of dirt.
That explains the sheer intensity of the emotion around this topic. I've always wondered why people in states thousands of miles from any border are so obsessed with it. It's because it's the only lever left on their control panel that actually seems to do something when they pull it.
Precisely. This leads to what they call nativist nationalist closure. The system creates a really vicious feedback loop. The more powerless people feel economically, the more they will demand violent closure at the border to psychologically compensate for that powerlessness.
So we've looked at the external border, the wall between the West and the rest. But what happens when that dark side logic, that exclusionary logic, bleeds inside the container. Because the book argues that even inside the democracy, the friend-enemy distinction is alive and well.
This is where we have to pivot to South Africa. And we need to spend some real time here because South Africa is presented as the ultimate test case for liberal democracy's success.
It's the Rainbow Nation, 1994. Nelson Mandela. The end of apartheid. It is supposed to be the single greatest victory for liberal democracy in the late 20th century. The miracle.
That is the narrative, the hegemonic discourse. And Thiven Reddy's analysis in Volume 3 takes a sledgehammer to that narrative. He argues very forcefully that while the personnel in government changed in 1994, the fundamental structure of the state did not.
How is that even possible? They had a universal election. They wrote a new constitution, one of the most progressive in the world.
They did. But Reddy uses the theories of Carl Schmitt to explain what's happening underneath the surface. Now, we should definitely flag here. Carl Schmitt was a German jurist and a member of the Nazi Party. He is a deeply controversial figure.
To put it mildly, so why are we using a Nazi's theory to explain post-apartheid South Africa?
Because Schmitt, despite his abhorrent politics, was a brilliant and ruthless dissector of how power actually works when you strip away all the liberal pleasantries. Schmitt argued that the essence of all politics, the irreducible core, is the distinction between friend and enemy.
Okay, us versus them.
Right. In a stable, homogeneous democracy, that distinction is usually external, our country versus that country. But in a settler colonial society, that distinction is internal and fundamental, the colonizer versus the colonized. Reddy's argument is that this structure, this violent bifurcation of society, was not washed away by the 1994 election.
But the ANC, the liberation movement, they took power. They became the government. Surely that changes things.
Yes. But they took over a state machine that was designed and built for colonial extraction and racialized control. And instead of dismantling that machine, they just started operating it. Reddy calls this bifurcated politics.
Bifurcated, meaning split in two.
Exactly. On one level, you have the elite, now both black and white, who play the game of liberal democracy. They have debates in parliament, they campaign for votes, they follow procedure.
That's the friend zone, politics among equals.
Precisely. But for the subaltern masses, the poor, the unemployed, the mine workers, the townships, politics is still a war zone. They are still treated as a problem to be managed, a threat to be contained, not as citizens to be served.
And is there a specific event that proves this? A smoking gun for this argument?
There is. The event that proves the system hasn't fundamentally changed is Marikana.
The Marikana Massacre, August 16th, 2012.
We need to really look at this event because it's not a footnote. This wasn't a skirmish or a protest that got out of hand. This was a mass shooting of workers by the state. Thousands of rock drill operators at the Lonmin Platinum Mine went on a wildcat strike.
These are men doing some of the most dangerous, back-breaking work on the planet.
Absolutely. Living in informal settlements, shacks without electricity or running water, and they were demanding a living wage. A living wage, not a fortune.
And the police were called in.
Not just regular police, heavily armed tactical units with automatic rifles, and on August 16th, they surrounded a group of striking miners and opened fire. They killed 34 men. Many were shot in the back while fleeing. It was an execution.
And the crucial detail here, the part that makes this so jarring, is who was in charge. This wasn't the apartheid regime doing this.
No. This was under the democratically elected ANC government. And even more damning, Cyril Ramaphosa, who is now the president of South Africa, but was then a director at the Lonmin Mining Company, and a senior ANC figure sent emails just before the massacre.
What did the emails say?
He called the strike dastardly criminal and called for concomitant action to be taken.
Concomitant action. That's a very clean, very bureaucratic way of saying bring in the heavy guns.
It is the language of the system. It's the language of an elite managing a problem. Reddy argues that Marikana revealed what's called the state of exception. It proved that for the poor black worker, the friend-enemy distinction is still the real rule of law.
So when they stepped out of line, when they threatened economic order, the extraction of platinum for global markets, they ceased to be citizens with rights.
They became enemies of the state.
Yeah.
And the state dealt with them as such.
It just destroys the miracle narrative completely. It suggests that the Rainbow Nation is a fresh coat of paint on the old colonial structure. The extraction of resources continues. Only the managers have changed their skin color.
And that leads to a terrifying realization for anyone who believes in democracy. If you can have free and fair elections, a world-class constitution, and a black president from the liberation movement, and still have the state massacring its own workers to protect foreign capital, then what is democracy really?
Is it a vehicle for freedom?
Or is it just a more sophisticated, more legitimate-looking mechanism for managing the population while the core business of extraction continues uninterrupted?
That question brings us to our final geographic stop, which might be the most complex and contested of all, Palestine.
Right. And this section, which analyzes the work of Tariq Dana, looks at a system of indirect colonial rule.
This is another one where the standard narrative is all about the peace process. We talk about the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. We talk about the Palestinian Authority, the PA, as a government in waiting. The idea is that they are slowly building the institutions of a future independent state.
And Dana's analysis suggests that this is a complete fiction, a dangerous fiction. He argues we need to view this through the lens of classic British imperial history. Think about how the British ruled a vast territory like India or parts of Africa like Nigeria. Did they have a British soldier on every single street corner in every single village?
No, of course not. That would be impossible. Far too expensive. It would require millions of troops.
Exactly. So what did they do? They used indirect rule. You find a local elite, the tribal chiefs, the maharajas, the local administrators. You give them a title, a bit of power, maybe some weapons, and the authority to collect taxes, and you make them an offer.
The offer being?
You keep the locals in line, you handle the petty crime, you stop the riots before they start. If you do a good job for us, you get to stay in power and you get rich. If you fail, we come in and crush you.
It's outsourcing the dirty work of occupation.
It's subcontracting repression. Dana argues, and this is the core of his analysis, that the Oslo Accords were not a peace treaty. They were a contract for indirect rule. Israel, as the occupying power, realized during the First Intifada that policing the West Bank directly was incredibly costly, economically, politically, and in terms of international reputation.
It looked bad on TV every night, and it cost a fortune in manpower.
So they created the Palestinian Authority. Now, if you are a Palestinian living in Ramallah or Nablus, the police officer who might arrest you is Palestinian. The bureaucrat who processes your building permit is Palestinian.
But who holds the ultimate power? Who controls the system?
Israel retains total control over security, borders, airspace, water, and the economy. The PA's primary function, structurally, is to securitize the Palestinian population. Their main job, as dictated by the system, is to ensure that Palestinians do not threaten Israeli settlements or the Israeli military.
This is what the source calls decentralized despotism.
Yes. It's a brilliant and insidious system because it shields the occupier. If Palestinians are angry about corruption or police brutality or a lack of basic services, who do they direct their anger at?
The PA, their own people.
Exactly. The PA acts as a heat shield for the occupation itself. It deflects popular anger.
But wait a second, let's try to look at this from the perspective of the PA leaders. Why would they ever agree to this? Are they just sellouts? Is it that simple?
Again, let's look at the incentives in the system, not the individual morals. The system offers them VIP status. Literally, they get VIP cards that allow them to pass through checkpoints that other Palestinians can't. They get control over billions of dollars in international aid money. They get to be treated like presidents and ministers on the world stage.
So the system rewards them for maintaining the status quo.
It rewards them handsomely. If they actually resisted in a meaningful way, if they stopped coordinating security with the Israeli army, for example, the privileges would vanish overnight, the money would be cut off, and the tanks would roll back into the cities.
So they're trapped in a kind of golden cage. They have all the trappings of power, the flags and the motorcades, but their only real function is to act as the prison guards for their own people.
And this is why the peace process itself creates a crisis of perception for the rest of the world. As long as there are negotiations and summits and partners for peace, the world can pretend that the occupation is temporary and on its way to being solved. It hides the grim reality of permanent colonial control.
This is all incredibly heavy. We've gone from the deadly borders of the Mediterranean to the mines of South Africa to the checkpoints of the West Bank. I think it's time to pull this all together. We promised the listeners a systems map, and I think we have enough pieces on the table now to build it.
Let's do it. If we look at the condition of democracy as a whole, what does the diagram of this system look like?
Okay, I'll start with the actors. First, and most obviously, we have the container state. Its primary drive, its core logic, is sovereignty. It needs to define who is in and who is out. Then we have the intermediaries, the local elites. The PA in Palestine, the post-apartheid ANC leadership in South Africa, their role is to be a buffer. They sit between the power and the people. Then at the bottom, we have the subalterns, the refugees, the Americana miners, the occupied Palestinians. They are the raw material of the system, either exploited for labor or excluded for security.
And don't forget the non-state actors, like the churches in Germany or the human rights NGOs, who try to break the rules of the system but often get crushed or co-opted for their trouble. Now let's look at the incentives. What makes the machine run? First and foremost, legitimacy. The system must look democratic on the surface. It needs the aesthetic of freedom.
The performance of democracy.
The performance, exactly. That's why you have elections in South Africa and a peace process in Palestine. Without that mask, it's just naked colonial violence, which is politically unstable in the modern world.
And then there's security. That's the engine, isn't it? The friend-enemy distinction isn't a bug. It's the fuel. The people inside the container, the friends, demand protection from the perceived threat of the people outside, the enemies.
And finally, the economic order. We haven't talked enough about Schumpeter, but the book relies on him heavily here. The economist Joseph Schumpeter viewed democracy as basically a market.
A market for votes, not a forum for deliberation.
Yes, he was incredibly cynical about it. He said democracy isn't the will of the people. That's a romantic fiction. It's just a marketplace where teams of politicians, the sellers, compete to win the votes of the public, the consumers.
And just like any market, it incentivizes some pretty bad behavior.
It incentivizes whatever works. If I'm selling a used car, I might exaggerate its features or hide its flaws. If I'm selling a political candidate, I might exaggerate a threat. Vote for me, or the migrants will take your house and your job. This marketization of politics explains why manipulation like we saw with Cambridge Analytica is now a standard feature. It's just aggressive marketing.
So if we map the feedback loop of this whole system, it looks like a downward spiral.
The system creates massive inequality, either through colonial extraction or neoliberal policies.
The subalterns at the bottom suffer and eventually resist. They go on strike, they cross borders, they protest.
Step 3. The state responds with repression. They shoot the miners, they build the walls, they send in the riot police.
To justify that violence to the rest of the citizens, the state ramps up the enemy narrative. They are terrorists, they are illegals, they are criminals.
Step 5. This narrative scares the voters inside the container, who then demand more security and tougher measures.
The state gets more authoritarian to meet that demand.
Which creates more suffering, which leads to more resistance, and you just repeat the loop.
That is the violence loop. And the tragedy is that every single turn of that loop hollers out the democracy a little more. The state becomes more reliant on police, on surveillance, on walls. Legitimacy slowly drains away. And eventually, you don't really have a democracy anymore. You just have a police state with a suggestion box.
This brings us squarely to the present day. We aren't just talking about history books. How does the system manifest right now in 2026?
Well, just look at the concept of the open prison, which the book applies to Palestine. The analysis traces the evolution of Gaza. It went from being a kind of open prison, where Palestinian labor could still move in and out to work in Israel, to a maximum security prison after the blockade. But the authors argue we are now seeing technologies of administrative exclusion being deployed everywhere.
Administrative exclusion. That sounds intentionally boring, like paperwork.
It is designed to look boring, but its effect is just as violent as a wall. Think about the EU asylum system. It isn't just a physical barrier. It's a massive bureaucracy designed to immobilize people. You trap people in reception centers on remote islands for years. You trap them in legal limbo where they can't appeal, they can't work.
They are physically present in Europe, but legally invisible.
It's a state of social death. You can't work, you can't rent an apartment, you can't get married, you can't build a life. You are a ghost in the machine. And this is a system output. It keeps the container pure without having to literally shoot everyone at the border, though that happens too. Yeah. It's a cleaner, more bureaucratic way of maintaining that old civilized versus barbarian distinction.
And that connects right back to the marketization of politics. If politics is just a market for votes, then truth doesn't really matter, does it?
No, not at all. In a market, the customer is always right, even if the customer is deeply irrational. If the voter wants to believe that refugees are getting free cars and cell phones, the politician seller is incentivized to say, yes, they are, and I will be the one to stop it. Appealing to fear and irrationality becomes a winning strategy.
But this is why the post-truth era isn't some strange accident.
It's a market efficiency. It's the logical outcome of treating democracy like a competition for consumers rather than a duty of citizens.
It's efficient for winning elections, but absolutely fatal for a functioning democracy. We usually end these deep dives by trying to find the so what for the listener. And one of our core themes at Crisis and Perception is always this idea of systems versus individual blame. I think this episode highlights that distinction more than any other we've done.
It really, really does. It is so tempting and so much easier to look at the Marikana massacre and blame the individual police commander who gave the order to fire, or to look at the West Bank and blame a specific Israeli prime minister, or to look at a cruel border policy and blame a specific president.
Now, look, of course, those people make choices. They bear a real moral responsibility for their actions.
They absolutely do. This isn't about absolving individuals, but the crisis in perception is failing to see that if you replace those specific individuals but kept the underlying system, the outcome would likely be the same or very similar.
Let's play that out as a thought experiment. If you magically replace the current, often corrupt PA leadership with saints' absolute moral paragons, but kept the Oslo structure intact,
They would still be forced to coordinate security with Israel to get their tax revenue. If they refused, the Israeli military would simply reoccupy the cities directly, the PA would collapse, and their people would suffer even more. The structure of the system dictates the function of the actor within it.
Okay, another one. If you replace the ANC leadership with saints, but the South African economy still fundamentally relied on exporting platinum at the lowest possible cost to be competitive on the global market.
Then when the workers struck for higher wages that would make the mines unprofitable, the saintly government would still face an impossible crisis. If we don't break this strike, the investors leave, the currency collapses, and the entire country goes broke. The systemic pressure to use state violence to restore order would be overwhelming.
So the real solution, if there even is one, isn't just elect better people, it's change the machine.
Yes, and that requires unlearning the hegemonic discourse. We have to stop assuming that legal means democratic or just.
That's a huge one. We equate the law with morality.
But apartheid was legal. The Holocaust was implemented through a legal framework. The Marikana shooting was defended in court as a legal act of policing. Conversely, the act of church asylum hiding refugees from the state is often illegal. But the authors of this book would argue it is the most democratic act possible in that situation because it asserts a universal humanity against the exclusionary logic of the container.
It pushes back against the closure. It tries to punch a hole in the wall.
It does, and that is where the book finds a sliver of hope, ironically. True democracy, according to Mackert, Wolf, and Turner, is not a static system we've already achieved. It is the force that resists closure. It is the ongoing struggle to expand the circle of friends and shrink the category of enemies.
So if our current version of democracy relies on borders, on exclusion, and on constantly finding new enemies to function,
Then we have to ask the hardest question of all. Is it actually democracy? Or is it something else? Is it, as the editors provocatively suggest, a master race democracy?
master race democracy. That is a phrase that hits you right in the chest. It's designed to shock.
It's meant to. It implies that for some to be free and prosperous inside the club, others must be subjugated or excluded outside of it. It implies that our freedom in the West is not a universal right we hold, but a privilege we have purchased with the exclusion and exploitation of the rest.
And if that's true, then the whole project of democratization isn't about exporting our system to the rest of the world.
How can you? You can't export a system that relies on excluding others. The only way to expand it would be to start dismantling the container we've built around ourselves.
That is a massive thought to end on. It changes how I look at the news. It changes how I look at the passport in my own pocket. It's not just a travel document. It's a membership card to the VIP club.
And that is the point of a deep dive like this. We aren't here to make you feel comfortable. We are here to help you see the system, because you cannot fix a machine if you refuse to even open the hood and look at the engine.
This deep dive was based on The Condition of Democracy, Volumes 2 and 3, edited by Jürgen Mackert, Anna Wolf, and Bryan S. Turner. We strongly encourage you to read these books or borrow them from a library to see the full scope of the research. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.